Please welcome to the stage, back to Sports Matters, Andy Jackson. I'm not sure where you get confused with music.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me? Perfect. All right, joining me, please give me a warm welcome for our panellists. Joining me on stage, Anna Fairnington, Account Director at 160over90, who is the Asia Pacific Agency Lead for all of Visa's sponsorships. We heard from Fernando earlier. And Magdalene Ong, who is Head of Marketing Communications Asia for beIN Sports. She joined beIN in 2016 and helped lay the foundation for beIN's business in the region. And joining us on live link up, hopefully you'll be able to see up there shortly, is Caroline Darcy. Caroline has worked in the sports marketing arena for a number of years, including a 16-year stint in Hong Kong, and most recently was Global Head of Sponsorship and Platforms at Standard Chartered, and she's joining us from Melbourne. Hi Caroline, can you hear us okay?
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're coming through loud and clear.
Great, hi.
No problem, welcome. So look, I wanted to start, before we take a look forwards, to really take a bit of a look backwards and go back to the start of the pandemic and its impact that it had off the pitch as well as on the pitch. So Caroline, an obvious, I want to come to you first. At the time you were at Standard Chartered, you are heading up Standard Chartered sponsorship of Liverpool, one of the longest standing and most valuable shirt front sponsorships in football. They were on the cusp of, or were looking very good for their first title in a long, long time, for the Liverpool fans in the room. And then COVID hit. I mean, how on earth did you deal with that? Could you give us some insight into how you just dealt with probably the biggest curveball that anyone's ever had in football sponsorship?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. And hi everyone, it's fantastic to join. Yeah, it was an incredible time for all of us, I guess. But yeah, coming into what was going to be potentially a very positive end of season celebration with Liverpool, looking to lift the trophy for the first time in 30 years. So since the inception of the Premier League, we basically had our end of season campaign locked and loaded, and we were ready to go. And then of course, pandemic hit. So the 2019-2020 season, really for us and for the league and for all the corporate partners, etc., it was a season of two halves. It was midway through the season, it was suspended indefinitely. So we didn't even have a clue of sort of when the potential restart date would be. So we connected with the club, of course, as we would do, being the main sponsor, and we worked closely with the club on trying to figure out how are we going to manage content? How do you, when the world is in turmoil, how do you manage that end of season content? When do you push it out? What tone should be? What should the frequency? How do you stay relevant? So we worked really closely with the club at the time, and we took their lead, and we basically hit the pause button. So we thought, okay, let's put a hold on all of our content and just catch our breath and sort of, refocus our efforts, work closely together. But what was fascinating, so as we were doing that, the players themselves basically jumped in to fill the gap, and it was done organically. And I found it absolutely fascinating, and it actually changed the way we viewed content moving forward. So the players were at home, they were at a loose end, the training grounds, etc., were closed. So they took it upon themselves to stay connected with their fans. I turned on their iPhones, took their iPhones.
Caroline, put 50p in the meter.
Exactly what the fans wanted. It was fantastic.
We lost you for about 10 seconds there, Caroline. So do you want to just repeat the last point? We got to where the players were sort of starting to take it over organically on their own channels. Could you just finish that point, because you froze a little bit there?
Sure, sorry. Yeah, so it ended up being golden content, and it was exactly what the fans wanted. So we looked at that and we thought, okay, the way we're going to be producing content during this period, it has to be different. It doesn't have to be fully polished. It can be raw, but it has to be authentic. So we took a lot of key learnings actually from the players during that time. We did like everyone, we did the pivot to digital. That was one of the buzzwords at the time. That even served our clients better because a lot of our clients at the time, well, a lot of Standard Chartered clients sit outside of Anfield or outside the UK and emerging markets. So they were never going to get to Anfield anyway. So we pivoted to digital and we took the key learnings from what the players were creating and went more organic, more authentic and more raw. It didn't have to all be 100% polished as previously done.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, having waited so long, for them to then lift the trophy at an empty stadium, again, must have been, in some ways, a little bit of an anticlimax, probably more for the players than anything else. But how did you create that sort of moment around that final moment of the season, which the fans have waited so long for? How did you make sure that still delivered an impact for you as the lead sponsor?
Yeah, actually, our end of season campaign, our moment in the sun with our fans and our clients, that part didn't actually change too much. Yeah. Because as I mentioned just before, a lot of Standard Chartered clients sit in emerging markets, so 95% of them won't get the chance to go to Anfield anyway. So we ran a tweet campaign, and it was the opportunity of fans to send through their congratulations tweet. And then we had them printed. This was all with the help of the club, and it was one of our most successful campaigns. We had them printed on little pieces of confetti, and then we had tremendous luck on the day, but during the trophy presentation, we had our tweets, or the fans' tweets, fly out of cannons each side of the stage, and because of the material they stuck on the trophy, so it was huge. It was hugely successful. We were able to bring the fans to that. We actually able to allow the fans to be part of that trophy celebration through this tweet campaign, which we'd planned from the start of the season. Yeah.
And also, I guess, fans that were not in the UK could actually be part of that and were part of that celebration on the ground. Okay.
Indeed.
Yeah, Mag, I want to come to you from a beIN perspective. I mean, obviously, personally, we were part of DAZN when the pandemic hit, and obviously, as a pure play OTT sports player, that was a challenge. And DAZN have gone on the record since around talking about the importance of sort of non-live programming and original content. How did you deal with the sudden loss of live sport in the region at beIN?
Well, I think, suffice to say that no one was ready for it.
Yeah.
It was mad scramble. When, the first league announced, we said, okay, what's going on here? And then, eventually everything got suspended. And, and we didn't know when it was going to resume. It was indefinite. So the team got together and, led by the MD, and we worked on a framework. We went into, we had this, what we call the 5 Rs. So I won't go into all of them, but, the first 3 Rs was about resolve, resilience, and the return. So the first was resolve. Obviously, we run both B2B and B2C. We have channels that we serve to the affiliate platforms in the region. We also have a live streaming app, beIN Sports Connect. And it was important to ensure that the affiliates continuously have content that we could promote on the channel and keep their consumers engaged. And similarly for beIN Sports Connect. So we were fortunate that we actually had evergreen content library of content that we could pull out immediately. Typically these programs, they do not get a lot of focus and promotion because we have a lot of live games that we have to cover and promote, and the ability for us to be able to do that, create stunts, a lot of promotions and campaigns, and putting them together and giving them to the affiliates, and also preparing all the marketing assets so that they can sustain. And then there was this part about resilience, because it was about 3 months that live sports was in suspension. Of course, we had to keep the content going, and we actively sourced for content, and we were able to rely on our studios in Doha and Miami who were still producing content. Keys and Gray were producing content from their balconies.
They could talk non-stop for longer than 3 months, those two.
Right,
Don't
and
worry
you
about
know,
that.
kind of, it was great that we were able to use VR content. There was also a period of great experiments. We were doing all sorts of different things. We were doing social media live commentary. We did a lot of challenges, stay-home challenges. We were also looking at what the athletes or the players were doing, and we were jumping on it, tagging them as we go along. Did esports, many activities, and you know there were a lot of great learnings that we took from the whole experience. You know I think it prepared us for the future. We know that this is something that we can learn from. And then, of course, the big return, you know, with the budget reserves that we had, you know, we were able to promote when the leagues came back in a bigger way. And I remembered that Bundesliga was probably one of the first leagues to return. And ratings were phenomenal. You know, again, demonstrates the power of live sports. You know, people were starved for content. And we had it in Australia, and it performed really well for us.
Right. It's quite interesting that both yourself and Caroline have picked out that the players took the lead organically, and arguably COVID was the period when live sports stopped and their arena was taken away, but they actually became the new rights holders in that period themselves, you know, as content producers, you know, A, because they had more time, and B, the freedom to do it, but also now the platforms, which is interesting. So I'm going to look forward now to 2022. We're just under a year away. I think it was a year to go. Yesterday, was it? Yeah. Yep. To the Qatar World Cup. And as we're all sort of adjusting to new normal, there's been an example today, hybrid events or whatever. This sort of isn't a normal World Cup anyway. It's a Winter World Cup. It's the first World Cup in the Middle East. So how does that, Anna, I'm come to you from a visa perspective? Obviously, we heard from Fernando earlier around the challenges in Tokyo. How are you planning for visa sponsorship of the World Cup this far out with all of the factors that you have to consider?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. So I think actually one of the things that's worked in our favor a little bit when we look towards the World Cup is the fact that our sponsorship of Beijing has become largely domestic on the Olympics, which is then, and also the fact now that the World Cup is being held in winter, it now gives Visa actually a longer lead time to start preparing the sort of activations and sell-in to the clients to activate around this sponsorship. So we're already having conversations now with a number of clients in the region to see what they can do to sort of drive the Visa business as well as their own business using the IP. And one of the things that's really working in our favor is obviously the time zone. So, you know, only having sort of a 5-hour lag behind us is a lot easier to work with in terms of viewing. And then also now the proximity of it being just a very small place, opposed to trying to get to someone like when we were in Russia to Vladivostok or, you know, something like that, is that part of Visa's rights is the consumer hospitality program. So that's actually a real sort of sell-in now that instead of seeing one game, you could potentially see 2 games as part of a sort of a 3-day trip. But as Fernando mentioned before, you know, with learnings from Tokyo is we don't know what's happening with COVID. You know, we are a year out. You're seeing a surge happening in different places right now. So instead of now looking at it as, okay, how are we going to pivot to potentially bring the World Cup like we did from the Olympics to home, it's part of our actual sell-in strategy. It's kind of like, yes, actually we want to get people on the ground there, but also at the same time, we're working on how do we bring those learnings from Tokyo to Qatar, to bring a viewing experience like a party in a box, bring that sort of accessibility to the consumers, whether they can go or whether they can't go.
Yeah. And in terms of this sort of experiential part, is there a cut-off point where you get to go, we need certainty by this point? I mean, you know, Fernando was talking, it was 100 days before when everything changed, you know.
I mean, don't quote me to this, because I think at the moment we're putting our positive hats on, and we're hoping that, you know, we're going ahead. We do have conversations, obviously, with our global team around these sort of hospitality programs and stuff, which will continue to keep evolving. But I think, you know, I think one of the learnings now is, you know, with some of the digital stuff, instead of looking at potentially as a negative that if we can't get there, it actually potentially brings a sort of a scalable way of bringing these money can't buy experiences actually to more people than just 10 people. It's actually maybe 100 people can do that. So let's see.
Okay, cool. The next topic I want to talk about is football's youth problem. And probably one of the biggest challenges, I think, facing everyone in football is where is the next generation of fans coming from? Some numbers here. I mean, Gen Z accounts now for 30% of the global population, but they're watching considerably less sport and football than millennials. We have Gen Alpha coming behind them, who will be 16 for the US World Cup. And there's been a paradigm shift in the platforms that those young people are on now. We've seen a shift towards the creator platforms like TikTok and Twitch. But then when you look at those platforms, football is actually considerably underrepresented. In fact, if you look at Twitch, YouTube, and TikTok, there isn't a football club, league, or player in the top 25 followed accounts. Whereas if you look at Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, it's a very different story. So that suggests there's a problem with football engaging with those young people. I mean, from a Footballco perspective, we are launching a youth brand called Next Gen, which has traditionally been our annual award for the best teenage footballers on the planet. That will now become our youth strategy, and will be an always-on separate media brand to hit young people through young footballers. You know, telling their human stories on and as well as off the pitch. So Caroline, I know you spent some time in F1 previously, and F1's a really good example as to how they've evolved their content offering to bring in a new and younger audience. Maybe you could share some of your experience and insights into that.
Yeah, sure. So my sort of experience in the world of Formula One has been on the event side at the Melbourne Grand Prix, and also on the sponsor side through my time with UBS. And it was just before the new wave of management came in. And during that period, like trying to sort of push out relevant content in a very agile way was quite tricky, because it was very, you know, the paddock club and the pit lane, it was really restrictive with what you could create. And once you did create, you had to go through sort of quite an arduous of approval process. And I remember at the time thinking, you know, I've got a 13-year-old son. It's like, it's probably nothing cooler for a 13-year-old son for their mum to work in Formula One, and he had no interest. He had no interest in it. You know, he wasn't going to get up and you know, watch the races, etc. Until he stumbled across the Netflix series, Drive to Survive. And then all of a sudden he became really interested in Formula One. And it was just interesting to me that, you know, the traditional way of building that fandom with the next generation through the live matches wasn't necessarily going to resonate with the younger generation. You know, my son's example, he's coming to Formula One now through a Netflix series. And then you look at the announcement this week, which I'm sure has been discussed at this conference, with Nike setting up their virtual world with Roadblocks. You know, the smart brands that are trying to get to the younger generation are going to where the younger generation are, and it is the Fortnite, the Roadblocks, etc. So yeah, that was my experience in Formula One, and how with the new wave of management and really sort of opening up the content creation, that I'm sure their numbers have really sort of headed in a much more positive direction.
Yeah, I heard Drive to Survive described as you know, it was the gateway to the race by creating a human drama out of the sport, which I thought was a really...
And a lifestyle, right?
Yeah, you know, and, you know, so to get young people to go straight from not being engaged with F1 to watching a 90-minute race on a Sunday and qualifying, that was too big a jump, and it was that gateway that sat in the middle and seemed to work if your son's experience is true. Mag, I'll come to you again. Let's take that example from a football perspective. Similarly, you know, a 15-year-old potentially is not going to go from not being a football fan or not caring about football too much, maybe playing a bit of FIFA, to watching 90 minutes. So as a broadcaster, how are beIN targeting those audiences, and on what platforms as well, importantly?
We're not so much on Twitch. You know, we're still dabbling with TikTok, trying to find that sweet spot and how to connect with the audiences there. What we do quite well, you know, we talk about the generation that grew up with mobile phones in their pockets. I read somewhere that they are a generation that learned to swipe before they learned to wipe. It's of course it's a challenge, and we were very, very active on in the recent years. We've stepped up our efforts on producing a lot more content for social media. We partner closely with Google. We produce match highlights post-whistle almost immediately. We see the value on continuous engagement. And what we've seen as well in our YouTube numbers, it's grown over the last 2-3 years. We're now 3 million strong in Asia, and 30% of them are below the age of 24. So they're still engaging with the content, and I think they're actively looking out for it. And once the game ends, they may not be able to watch the full game, but if they're actively looking for it, if they're searching for PSG, the first thing we want them to be able to see is to surface the right content. And with Google, we work with Google One Box, where we surface a lot of our match highlights right at the top of the page. And I think this continuous engagement, producing content when they want it, and giving it to them, it helps the overall live sports experience.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a generation that we need to convert them 18, 20 before we lose them completely. You won't become a football fan at the age of 35 if you're never invested in it. So along with that as well, I think what we compete with is time, and a lot of them prefer to be online. These days, you hardly see kids going out playing in an unstructured way, football or participating. And I think more so in Singapore context. So I think participation is key. You need to get them involved. You need to get them participating, and then the love and passion for the sport will grow.
Yep.
So there's a strong correlation between youth playing and fan loyalty.
Yeah, I think as well, one of the is it's not just about making the content shorter. It's not just about taking the 90 minutes and making it into a minute. It's about telling a different story, right? And bringing people in with a different type of content or a different format. I saw a great quote, I think it was in Sports Pro a couple of weeks ago, where it said that people aren't on Twitch because they couldn't find football on TV. They're on Twitch because they did find football on TV and wanted something different. And I think that is a really good quote. All right, we have got about 9 minutes left, and it would be completely remiss of me with 3 female panelists on a football panel to not turn our eyes towards women's football in general and in Asia. I think, Jasper, he's got a stat that he wants to put up around women's football fans in Asia. Have we got that? Yeah, so 49 million female football fans in Southeast Asia alone. I think the last Women's World Cup boasted a cumulative TV audience of over 1 billion. Elsewhere, we're seeing women's football exploding in popularity with significant increases across the board in terms of sponsorship, broadcast deals, but it sort of feels like Asia is lagging behind a bit. So I'm interested to get my panelists' view on that. Mag, I know this is something that you're particularly passionate about. Well, where do you think, what comes first? Does the investment need to come first and then the quality will follow, or do we need to see the quality of the product improve first and then the investment will follow that?
I think it requires a holistic approach. I don't think, one or the other. I think as a start, participation by women in football is important. And take, for example, in Singapore, football is not offered as an extracurricular activity in schools. So, with the low participation, there's no real push to create a framework for women to succeed or girls to succeed in football. So, let's take, for example, in Southeast Asia, the best team is the Thai team, the Thai women's team. But, and they went quite far, and they went to the Women's World Cup, the first Southeast Asian team to qualify. Of course, everyone laughed when they lost to USA by 13-0, unprecedented. but they've gone so far and excelling in their sport, and in an environment where it doesn't really nurture for them to excel. Post World Cup, when they go back, the women's league in Thailand, it's semi-professional. They've got day jobs to keep to earn a living.
Yeah.
And so in order for women to succeed, I think, they need the proper foundation that they can build on to capitalize on their talent.
Yeah, Anna, I mean, obviously Visa is a partner of the FIFA tournaments, women's and men's, and has made additional investments in women's football elsewhere. I mean, what do you think needs to happen in Asia before it becomes a more viable proposition for brands like Visa?
Yeah, I think Visa is actually, I think, the biggest global sponsor in women's football now, through their sponsorship of the UEFA as well, Women's League. And actually, I was talking, what you were jumping on that is, I think there's also been a lack of role models for sort of Asian footballers to look up to. I think in the past, because of not having it part of the curriculum and gender inequality, we were actually talking to one of our Team Visa athletes on Friday, Ellie Carpenter, and she mentioned how big, and she hadn't realized how big a role model she was for Australian footballers, and the fact that the Women's World Cup is going to be held in Australia, it suddenly becomes a tangible thing on soil. So I think this is going to be a huge thing for this part of the world, because I think, again, it's going to be a lot more visible, it's going to be televised, and I think they're going to start seeing it as a viable thing. And then also sponsors like Visa are taking on board the fact that it's not the same as the men's game in terms of the financial security, and they're now working with a lot of the footballers on initiatives to what can they do after they retire. So there's an initiative they're working on the second half, and it's about seeing how they can then take their skills from football into the world of business. So I think that's that kind of investment to show that these then encourages women to actually take it up as a career, because they know that they're actually at the end of it, there will be security, which that might not exist right now.
Okay. I mean, also, I think, one of the things is about women's football, but also female football fans. We're sort of certainly seeing on goal, our female audience is exploding, over the last sort of 12, 18 months, to the point that sort of over 1 in 3 are female fans now coming to a football website. So we're also seeing an explosion, not just an interest in the women's game, but in football in general from women. Caroline, coming back to you, your time at Standard Chartered with Liverpool, where did the female team and female fans factor into your Liverpool activations and how you plan that?
Yeah, I think we've seen some really encouraging signs, particularly over the last couple of years, and I guess it's post-World Cup, where you'll see Premier League teams treating the women's team very differently. I think, in the past it was sort of, if you sponsored the men's team, the women's team, in many instances was sort of thrown in as a value add. But clubs are treating the women's team, and particularly LFC had some really encouraging signs, treating it very differently, having separate budgets, separate teams, dedicated KPIs, etc. But there's still a lot more to be done. And I think that just on that commercial side of it, there does need the money in there. The sponsors need to be coming into it. But I think the sponsors and the partners really need to be holding the clubs and also the organising bodies' feet to the flame on this, that it does need to continue to, increase the focus if we want the sport to grow. The way we handled it at Standard Chartered was exactly like that. We had a dedicated team, we had separate budgets, we had separate KPIs. It ended up, it's a very valuable part of the sponsor portfolio, but I think a lot more focus needs to be on women's football in general moving forward, and particularly with pressure coming from sponsors.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes, so I'm going to ask each of my panelists on the women's football, what do you think could be the one development in Asia that could really, transform women's football in this market? How do we engage the 49 million fans? What's one thing that could happen that could change that? Who wants to take that?
Do you mean now in terms of the actual game? I think it just needs to be more visible. I think whether that's on broadcasters, if it's more content, and having these guys have the voice to speak up, whether it be on their own channels, and then the sponsors who getting behind them and helping promote them not just as footballers but across the different verticals like we do now with Visa across, like, say, fashion, for example.
Yep.
And it just gets a bit more
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting,
broader.
you know, what DAZN have done with UEFA Champions League
exactly.
is partnered with YouTube and are putting every game free to air on YouTube to that point, just to get as many eyeballs on it as possible. May, anything from your side?
So I think, you know, in terms of a lot more exposure, we had the Women's World Cup in 2019. You know, we did all we could to push it forward. We were pushing out clips, moments, but, you know, everything around it was fairly muted. So, you know, along with that, when there's not enough exposure, of course the ratings would suffer. So I think as collectively, I think, you know, we all can do our part. The broadcasters can do their part, advertisers, sponsors, to pump in enough that, you know, women's football get enough exposure.
Yeah. And Caroline, if she's still with us? Oh, she's dropped off again. All right. Well, look, we'll wrap it up there. I don't know whether there's any questions. Probably not for Caroline. But if there's any questions for us on the panel, any hands? Can't see. You got any? No. Okay. We'll wrap it up there. So look, if you love it, please join me saying a massive thank you to my panelists, Anna and Mag on stage here. Caroline in Melbourne, you're back with us to say thank you. Thanks for joining us. And also I just wanted to say congratulations to Jasper and the branding crew on bringing live events back to Singapore. It's been a joy to wear long trousers and socks again. Thank you.